thank you. I can't see you, but I'm sure you're lovely. And thank you all for coming out in the snow tonight. I am thrilled to be here to introduce Jamel Brinkley. Jamel's first book, A Lucky Man, was a National Book Award finalist, is currently a finalist for the Robert Bingham Prize and the Story Prize, and was the winner of the Ernest J. Gaines Award for Literary Excellence. His work has appeared in the Best American Short Stories and won fellowships from the Iowa Writers Workshop, the Wisconsin Institute for Creative Writing, and Stanford University, where he is currently a Wallace Stegner Fellow. That would ordinarily be a stunning collection of accolades for a debut story collection, but I had the pleasure of not being stunned by any of them because I'd read the book and was lucky enough to know before everyone else got the chance to just how gorgeous and important these stories were. Jamel's work emphasizes the rich interior lives of Black men and boys, their complexity, often its own implicit indictment of a world that would deny them the capacity to be layered, to be nuanced, to be more than one thing, and to be smart enough to know it. When I read Jamel's work, I am stunned by his capacity to render starkly and with empathy the worst things that may have happened to people, abandonment, abuse, literal and metaphoric imprisonment, but to always create such texture on the page, such layering, that a reader cannot leave the story without remembering that people are always more than the worst things that have happened to them, more than the worst things they've done. Jamel's stories make magic out of their movement through time. He understands that the self is always in negotiation or under construction, and the best way to reveal that on the page is often to think about the pressure of memory on the present. Jamel and I have joked that in spite of the persistent rumors that we write short stories, we are both, in fact, long story writers, and I find in his work the best use of the maximal story form, writing that understands the short story not as a confined space, but a form in which the right moment can allow the reader to access the past, present, and future at once. There is always great surprise and revelation in what the present calls to mind for his characters, an associative understanding of the world that is sharper for not being linear. As the Chicago Review of Books put it, a lot of short stories exist in a snow globe, but the 9 stories presented here are each a big bang. They burst forth through space and time. Before the book came out, I had the opportunity to talk to Jamel for a profile, and I told him that one of the things I found most rewarding about his work was how much joy there was in it. I read a lot of short stories, and as much as I love the form, I sometimes find that any pleasure in a short story feels like a trick, the joy dangled there to remind us that in the end, the story will take it away. Joy in A Lucky Man is indeed, see, you've read short stories. Joy in A Lucky Man is indeed often short-lived, but it's so sharp and vivid on the page that for both readers and characters, it is no less real for being fleeting, in no way diminished by what may come after. When I asked Jamel about this, he talked about sound and lyricism, an answer that seemed obviously true as soon as he said it. Rather than using the lyric mode to dress up trauma, Jamel's work lets things that hurt, and the pleasure of being alive ring true in spite of them. I won't keep you any longer. From the pleasure of hearing his work for yourself, I am delighted to introduce Jamel Brinkley.
Good evening, everybody. I'd like to thank Danielle for that beautiful introduction. And I'd like to thank the Y for the honor of inviting me to read with Valeria tonight. And thank you all for being here. I'm going to read from, speaking of long stories, I'm going to read from the longest story in my collection, which is entitled Everything the Mouth Eats. A brief note, the word capoeira shows up a few times in what I'm going to read. And for those of you who don't know, capoeira is an Afro-Brazilian art form that combines dance, martial arts, and music. Everything the mouth eats. I've started this story many times and deleted the pages many times. The reasons aren't a mystery. I keep seeing the face of my brother to the exclusion of anything else, and I keep getting lost. But perhaps there's no other way it can be written. The face of my brother, which resembles my face much more than I've ever been willing to admit, in many ways is the story. Also, if I'm going to be honest, I have to confess from the outset that I've always been terribly lost. I want to tell this story, and I want to tell it honestly. The trip to the Capoeira event that morning, years ago now, should have taken less than an hour, but somehow I ended up driving us west of Arlington, and I messed up again near Springfield. My brother, Carlos, sat in the back with baby Rosa. His girlfriend, Sulai, beside me in the passenger seat, was growing increasingly baffled. Her hazel eyes waxed full, mouth opening and closing as she reluctantly surrendered to the strict silence Carlos and I had sealed into the space of the car. She probably felt every single effort we had made to first create the germ of silence and then to cultivate it, conspiring to be cruel to each other. We drove in their beat-up black Honda. Energy bar wrappers, water bottles, juice boxes, and flat orange peels were strewn all over. The red corner of a children's book and a library copy of In Our Time peeked out from the gap between the passenger seat and the console box. Next to Carlos, 3 pairs of unlaced sneakers had been tossed on top of a pile of folded pants and t-shirts. On the rear deck behind his head sat musical instruments, or parts of them. The strong, sweet, and sour odor of a small child, an odor Carlos and Sulai probably didn't notice anymore, infected the car's cooled air. Beneath this hung the heavy, stale smell of cigarettes. When I'd insisted on driving, Carlos had immediately announced he would sit in the back with their daughter. I'd claimed I knew the DC area and could get us from there to Prince William Forest Park in Virginia. This on the basis of trips I had been making from New York down to Northeast to see a girl I couldn't bring myself to love. But I'm a terrible driver. I get especially nervous on highways. Something seems apocalyptic about them. It's difficult to see other people clearly in their cars, and the speed of it all recalls the desperation of escape. I'm awful at figuring out when to change lanes. The deceptive monotony gets to me, and the arrows point all over the damn place. My eyes dart from mirror to mirror, and I end up misreading signs or not seeing them at all. I somehow failed to get us onto the interstate, and Sulai couldn't contain herself any longer. She turned to Carlos, and her face asked him for help, but none was forthcoming. Despite her harried appearance, Sulai sounded calm when she turned back and spoke to me in her lilting voice. "Eric, are you sure you don't want one of us to drive?" I shook my head stiffly, slicing the air twice with my chin. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as Carlos, whom I had seen grinning in the rearview mirror since we left their apartment in Tacoma Park, seemed to decide on his line of attack. For a moment, our gazes met. "You know 95 is pretty big, don't you?" he said, not to me, but to Sulai. "One of the longest interstates in the country, if I'm remembering right. Main artery of the East Coast, but I'm not telling you anything you don't already know." He had lifted one hand from the car seat to carve shapes in the air, a conductor of his own voice, and then settled it somewhere near his chin. The tip of his finger played in the patch of fuzzy hair under his bottom lip. His other hand was agitated in his pocket, jingling keys and coins as Rosa sneezed herself awake. "Your uncle is just like me," he said to his daughter. "Got those fat, juicy veins in his arms, a doctor's dream. But every once in a while, you get one of those who doesn't know what he's doing, and he stabs your arm all the hell trying to draw blood. Meanwhile, there's a fat, juicy vein sitting right there." "What are you talking about?" Sulai asked. Carlos gave a short laugh. "I swear, one time I nearly grabbed the damn needle and stuck it in myself. No lie." The rhythmic ring of metal in his pocket had stopped. "Life is hard enough," he said. "It pains me. It physically hurts when people fuck up what's easy and obvious." I inhaled deeply to stay calm and then smiled at Sulai. "So," I said, "he's still smoking, huh?" Carlos winked at her. Babe, tell my brother it's actually been months. No, tell him this. It just takes a long time for old stink to go away. I hadn't had a real talk with my brother in many years. Maybe we'd never had one. In any case, I wasn't sure either of us even knew how. The truth was, I didn't really want to talk to him, but I felt guilty or duty-bound to our mother. So on this trip, I kept trying to persuade myself that I would try. The only way Carlos and I were going to speak to each other right now was to argue. And since I didn't want to start a full-on argument in the car, I didn't ask Sulai about his drinking or his search for a steadier job. The relatively good terms of our relationship were a new and tenuous development. Surely he felt as much as I did the strain of proceeding word by word, gesture by gesture, with so much delicacy. We'd been rebuilding things slowly, ever since I found out from our mother that he had been, essentially, homeless. Going to the conference together was a part of that rebuilding. I was trying to show that my interest in him and in the things that mattered to him was real. Since we started talking again, Carlos would go on and on about what he called his blessings, which he said had saved his life. At first there were two, Sulai and Capoeira. Rosa became the third. He would go on, and the repetition was something he could rely on in the strangeness of our attempts to communicate. One day, over tea in a chilly DuPont Circle cafe, when I was tired of him repeating himself, I stared at Sulai. I'd been staring at her all afternoon, and asked about capoeira. I knew a little about it. I worked as an adjunct professor in downtown Manhattan and had seen a circle of people doing it in Union Square Park. Or, rather, I had seen other people crowded around the people doing it. Amid the clamor of 14th Street traffic, the pedestrian multitudes, and the constant noise of my own thoughts came the half-heard music, wah-wah sounds interspersed with vague buzzing and high-tone flutters. My question was for Sulai, but my brother was the one who spoke. First of all, he said, you don't do capoeira, you play capoeira, and you live it. He started talking about African martial art traditions and enslaved Africans in Brazil, the development of the form there, and its spread to the United States and other countries. He talked more rapidly now about music and rituals and perspective. After mentioning antagonistic cooperation, a phrase I associated with the writer, Ralph Ellison, he went on to philosophize about what it meant to, quote, see the world upside down. He wasn't answering the question. He was lecturing. Just tell me what the hell it is, I said. He reached over to Sulai and held one of her blue mittened hands. Capoeira é tudo que a boca come, he said to her, and then became quiet. His silence then was supposed to be as profound as the one he settled into now in the black Honda, after successfully having the last word. It would be a relief to finally arrive and escape the space of the car, which felt increasingly small with every passing mile. Carlos and I refer to each other as brothers, but technically we're half-brothers. I was born in North Carolina, and he was born in New York. Our mother met the man who would become my stepfather, Carlos's father, in Brooklyn, when she was struggling and unhappy with her job at Montgomery Ward. He was a counselor then, and in those days, though I find it hard to believe, he treated my mother with great kindness. She says he gave her sound advice, but more important, he took an interest in her beyond her employment, an interest that alleviated her loneliness. Soon enough, they were seeing each other, and then we were leaving Brooklyn for the Bronx to move in with him. My own father is a man I have no memory or evidence of. The first clear images I have of my stepfather are from the day we moved when I was 4. He lived near the top of a housing project in the South Bronx, in the same apartment where he had grown up. I gawked at the sheer size and formidable brick of the building and of the buildings that stood around it, throwing down enormous shadows everywhere. And so he too became impressive. He was an overweight but striking man with large hands, light skin, and wide, active eyes. With his thick black horseshoe mustache, he was trying to approximate or even surpass Willie Colon, whose face would appear again and again if you flipped through the sleeves of his record collection. I was so impressed, which is to say frightened, by these buildings, by this man, by this new scale of being, that I peed my pants just as we were about to board the elevator that would take us up to our home. When it wasn't broken, that elevator took us to and from our home on the 10th floor for over 10 years. In the first of those years, my mother became pregnant with my brother. I don't remember anything about his birth or his first appearance in our apartment, but I do remember feeling vaguely indignant that I would no longer be an only child. I also remember that Carlos was a fussy baby, not allowing anyone but our mother to hold him, though later, with no effort or enthusiasm on my part, he suddenly warmed up to me. One of his first words, yelled frequently from his crib, was Ba-Dee, the nonsensical pet name he had invented for me. There was something antic and skittish about him, however, so I didn't feel whatever connection I was supposed to. Carlos's father had a game he liked to play, especially during the time our mother was taking evening classes in accounting when we, the two boys, were alone with him. He began it as soon as Carlos could talk. He would take one of us onto his lap and say, "Who do you belong to?" We quickly learned that the correct answer was Daddy, but the speed of our learning was less important than the speed of our response, and we could never respond quickly enough. As soon as he asked the question, even if it seemed that the answer came right away, even if the answer interrupted the question, he would begin relentlessly tickling whichever boy was sitting on him. Countless times his thick fingers would clamp onto my narrow rib cage, and no matter how much I screamed the word Daddy, I would be left gasping and nearly crying. Carlos was also a subject of his regime of laughter and filial affection, yelling and thrashing until he slid from his father's lap and shared with me the mercy of finally making it down to the floor. Afterward, we would often be forced to massage his feet. He'd be on the couch and we'd still be on the floor, each of us with a bare foot. I remember the sour smell, the hard skin on his sole and under his big toes. But we were only slightly menaced by this game. If he came home from work and sent us trembling to the floor, then it meant he was in a good mood. On such evenings, he might also play some of his pop records. With this music blasting out of the speakers, he would dance, his brow knitted, his bottom lip sucked into his mouth, spinning and sliding in his thin dress socks. I would join in mostly by jumping up and down. Carlos moved with more grace and sophistication. He understood his limbs and his hips, and he understood time. Even then, he was a skilled and intelligent dancer. Once, when my brother and I were out of school for some odd holiday, my stepfather took us to work with him for the first time. The building where he worked in Lower Manhattan was imposing and severe, a place that supposedly handled matters of justice, but which nevertheless looked merely like a prison. The three of us went through a metal detector and rode an elevator to one of the highest floors. It was morning, but my brother and I were allowed to get potato chips, red licorice, and soda from the vending machines. As we made our way down the hall, Carlos's father had us peek into certain cubicles and offices so he could show us off to his coworkers. After we got to his office, a middle-aged white woman with a long neck and her hair in a tight bun came in to chat. She pointed to my brother and said, "Oh my God, is this your son?" "They both are." Well, this one looks just like you, the same smile, the wavy hair. Look at his adorable baby fat. These are my boys, he said. But this tall guy isn't your biological, right? He looked at her then in that familiar way, his eyelids parted as far as they could go, the orbs themselves seeming to have moved a full inch out of their sockets. She appeared to be the sort of person who walked around the office saying things she shouldn't say. If he'd had the proper authority, he might have fired her on the spot. Instead, he stood behind me and put a strong hand on each of my shoulders. Yes, he is, he told her calmly. They both are, like I said. Everyone in that room, except maybe Carlos, who was very young, though even he may have sensed it, knew this was a ridiculous statement. My stepfather's colleagues had to be at least somewhat familiar with the basic facts of his home life. Also, I looked nothing like him, and at the time I looked nothing like Carlos. His hair was curlier and softer, mine lighter by a few shades. Only later would a few similarities of nose and cheek from our mother become apparent. It was possible and less absurd that I had been grabbed off the corner for the purpose of an office gag. The woman pinched her mouth shut and then went out of the door, leaving us alone in the room with my stepfather's lie. You are my son, he said, not gently. You know that, right? The look on his face wasn't very different from the one he had given the woman, and his voice was a double voice. I heard the unmistakable command in the lower one, so I nodded. He sat down in the chair next to his desk and made Carlos and me stand together before him. A distance from my brother opened suddenly, as if each of the years between our births had stretched into a tract of desert. Who do you belong to? He asked us. There was no threat of tickling this time, which somehow made things worse. Daddy, we said. In addition to taking evening classes, our mother had also started a day job, which meant that I had to walk Carlos to and from our nearby school and babysit him until an adult got home. In those unsupervised hours after school, we never had much to say to each other. We played, however, and I began to play rough with him. Back then, we watched professional wrestling on television, and it was easy to persuade him to let me try out the moves. When we played this way, I always took on the role of the villain, the heel. I'd pick him up and slam his body onto our dingy couch, bend his spine against my knee, apply various chokeholds, pretend to smash his head into the wall. We both knew that pro wrestling was fake, at times barely on the threshold of convincing physicality, and we played in the same spirit. This usually extinguished the aggression that flared within me. But one day when I was in 8th grade and Carlos was in 3rd, we wrestled for a long time until I had him in a chokehold called the sleeper. I was behind him with one arm wrapped around his neck and the other cradling the side of his head. This was routine for us. I would pretend to squeeze his windpipe and he would pretend to gasp for breath, swinging his arms stiffly in the air until he feigned unconsciousness. But this time, all I saw in my mind was my biceps. Carlos flailed as I kept flexing, and I was fascinated by the way a part of my body could be hardened into stone. Even when his weight sagged against me and he stopped flailing, I kept on with the routine, now acting as the referee. I let him slump against the front of the couch, then lifted his arm by the wrist and let it drop. I lifted it again and it dropped and he fell onto his side. If his arm dropped a 3rd time, it would mean I had put him to sleep and that I had won the match. But I never won this way. Carlos had never let his arm drop a 3rd time. He would hold it in the air to signal consciousness and his eyes would pop open and then he would go on the attack. That afternoon, however, his arm did drop a 3rd time. I raised my fists in victory and stomped around the living room, jeering at the imaginary crowd that surrounded us as my brother lay on the floor. Full of uncaged power, I laughed and pointed at him to show the crowd how weak their hero was. I planted my foot on his hip and raised my fists again, but when he didn't move, I began to get scared. His fingers were curled like shriveled leaves, and one of his legs was bent at an unnatural angle. I nudged him with my foot. Was he breathing? I squatted beside his heaped body and began to shake him. Tears ran down to my nostrils and my jaw. Carlos, I'm sorry, please wake up, I kept saying. Carlos, wake up, I'm sorry, please. Wake up, I'm so sorry. When he finally woke up, his squinting eyes blinked with confusion. Maybe it was because he realized what had happened or because he saw my tears, but he started crying too. He held his arms out toward me, but I backed away, afraid. In this moment, how could either of us think touch was a good thing? I wiped my cheeks. Why didn't you breathe, I said. You're not supposed to stop breathing. Why didn't you say something? He kept nodding, accepting the blame as he cried. But you can't tell, I said. Carlos, you can't tell what happened. We'll get in trouble. We both will. We'll get a beating. So you can't tell. Carlos never did tell on me. He was convinced that I had saved us from a beating, and he may have even thought I had saved his life. In gratitude, he built a little religion and installed me as its godhead. This went beyond a younger sibling's normal admiration for his elder. In a way, I had once again become Badi, the alpha of his first and most private language. He was so single-minded in his devotion that thereafter, when his father tickled him and asked, "Who do you belong to?" it was a shock that he didn't respond by naming me. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I can't see anybody out there, but thanks so much for coming tonight in the snow. I'm so honored to be here to give this brief introduction to my friend Valeria. I'll just start right in. How long ago is it that Valeria and I first met in New York? 8 years, maybe? Her cousin in Mexico City, Juanca, is a close friend. Meeting her was like a sweetly nostalgic haunting, because my late wife had also come from the glorious UNAM, the public university in Mexico City, to study for her doctorate at Columbia. And Valeria was also full of brilliance and that chilanga verve and hilarity. It wasn't long before she showed me some of her writing. I forget which piece first, but I think it was the one about looking for Joseph Brodsky's grave in Venice. Searching for a grave, she writes in that essay, is to some extent like arranging to meet a stranger in a cafe, the lobby of a hotel or a public square, in that both activities are ways of being there and looking. At a given distance, every person could be the one waiting for us, every grave the one we are searching for. That sentence alone, like a soft explosion of poetry and thought, blows open shutters on a landscape your mind wants to go roaming in, and gives you a new way of being there and looking. She was a grad student from Mexico City, but now, 8 years on, there are thousands and thousands of readers who, coming upon that sentence, maybe not having read it before, would immediately think, that seems like a Valeria Luiselli sentence. Over the ensuing years, Valeria has published 4 acclaimed books, a pair of novels, a book of essays, a book-long essay, each of these formerly unique, like nothing else, ranging from the nearly demented dervish playfulness of Story of My Teeth to the more morally urgent, nothing remotely like it ever before, an indispensable Tell Me How It Ends, a surgical yet emotionally wrenching inquiry and meditation on child refugees of Central America and the lethal absurdities of our immigration laws and courts. I knew beforehand that Valeria was in some way novelizing that book and incorporating the experience of a trip she'd taken into the Southwest and to the border with Alvaro and their children. I was expecting something remarkable, but I wasn't expecting to have my mind utterly blown like this. Lost Children Archives is a novel that already seems destined to become synonymous with our time, one that somehow also transforms that time, the way we are in it, the way we look at it and read it. Has anybody so captured what it is like to be alive in the USA right now so perfectly as Valeria has, just when she writes, something changed in the world. Not too long ago it changed, and we know it. We feel time differently. No one has been able to capture what is happening or say why. Perhaps it's just that we sense an absence of future because the present has become too overwhelming, so the future has become unimaginable. It would be impossible here to name everything I love about this novel, partly because with every passing hour, something else occurs to me. A book, like others of Valeria's, that makes its radically original processes transparent and accessible to us, seems to include us in it so that we experience its writing and thinking, the living that went into it, its pain and rapture, its ghostliness and visceral vivacity in the reading of it, all at once, in surround sound, surround vision, surround thought. An American road trip novel simultaneously elevated into every classic road trip in literature, film, and art. How smart it was of her to leave that GPS behind. A novel whose patterns and structures are deeply musical, orchestral, but rock and roll too, circular and driving forward at once. That a book that executes the humble writerly disciplines, reminding me time and again of the Ford Madox dictum that you can't have a man appear long enough to sell a newspaper in a story unless you put him there with enough detail to make the reader see him. That radiant specificity, a secret to letting the reader see and sense its vast blinded emptinesses as well, its silences and ghosts. The narrator reflects, how can a radio documentary be useful in helping more undocumented children find asylum? Let's think of that as an existential question. Probably most of us would like somehow to be useful in this way, but how? One step is not to forget what it is like to be a child, whether loved and nurtured or lost and alone in the most treacherous landscape. Don't stop being a little girl, thinks the narrator to the daughter. Always defend yourself from this empty, fucked up world. Cover it with your thumb. Among this novel's many gifts to the reader are the ways in which it repeatedly shows how, quote, children's imaginations destabilize our adult sense of reality and force us to question the very grounds of that reality. The more time one spends surrounded by children, writes Luiselli, disconnected from other adults, the more their imaginations leak through the cracks of our own fragile structures. In ways both concrete and abstract, isn't our true job on earth to protect and guide and look out for children, whether as parents, relatives, or citizens? It is in the way it brings this often unfathomable world of childhood closer to us that Lost Children Archive engenders a love of that transcendent and manifold duty and begins to change us. Thank you.
Thank you, Paco, wherever you are now. But it was 10 years ago, not 8. So let's not hide our ages. I just put my finger all over my glasses, so excuse me a minute. I'm going to read, so there are 3 different threads, at least 3 different threads, and 3 different narrators in this novel. And what I'm going to do is just read you a scene from each of these narrators. The first one is a woman narrator, the mother of 2 kids who are traveling with her and their father on a road trip across the country. The second voice is the voice of one of those kids, a boy, who's 10 years old and decides to run off at some point with his sister, and they get lost. I won't say too much. And then the third voice is a third-person narrator who tells the story of 7 children who are migrating aboard a train and across different borders. Nouns. Unhappiness grows slowly. It lingers inside you, silently, surreptitiously. You nourish it, feeding it scraps of yourself every day. It's the dog kept locked away in the back patio that will bite your hand off if you let it. Unhappiness takes time, but eventually it takes over completely. And then happiness, that word, arrives only sometimes and always like a sudden change of weather. It found us on our 10th day into the trip. I had called a number of motels in Graceland. None picked up, except one. An old lady answered the phone, her voice like a distant fire crackling its way into my ear. Elvis Presley Boulevard Inn at your service. I wondered if I was misunderstanding her when she said, "Yes, ma'am, plenty of room here and a new guitar pool." But we find exactly that, a motel all to ourselves. A motel with a swimming pool in the shape of an electric guitar. A motel in which, instead of a bedside Bible, there's an Elvis Presley songbook. A motel with Elvis Presley everything, everywhere, from the hand towels in the rooms to the salt and pepper shakers in the breakfast area. The boy and his father stay behind in the parking lot, rearranging the daily puzzle of our luggage, and the girl and I run up to the room to pee. We climb stairs, walk past eerie Elvis wax statues, hundreds of pictures and cartoons, an Elvis piñata, an all Elvis jukebox, small statuettes, yellowing t-shirts with a king's face nailed to the walls. By the time we make it to our room, we have understood, she in her own terms, that we're in some sort of temple or mausoleum. She's understood that this man is or was something important. She looks up at a photograph of a 30-something-year-old Elvis Presley hanging on the wall between the 2 double beds in our new room and asks, "Is that Jesus fucking Christ, Mama?" No, it's Elvis. "Mama, could you leave Papa and marry Elvis if you wanted?" I try not to laugh, but I do. I say I'll consider it, but then I tell her, I would, except he's dead, my love. This poor young man is dead? He is. Like Johnny Cash is dead? Mm-hmm. Like Janis Joplin is dead? Mm-hmm. When the boy and my husband walk in with bags and suitcases, we all change into our swimming suits and run down to the guitar pool. We forget the towels and the sunscreen, but then again, we're the type of family that has never taken a picnic blanket to a picnic or beach chairs to a beach. The girl, so cautious and philosophical in all her daily activities, becomes a wild beast in the water. She is possessed, delirious, beats on her own head and stomach like one of those post-hippie drummers who's been on LSD for too many decades. Her laughter thunders in her open mouth, all milk teeth and perfect pink gums. She howls as she jumps into the pool, wriggles her way to freedom from our nervous clutches, discovers underwater that she does not know how to surface. So we fish her out and hold her tight and say, don't do that again. Be careful. You don't know how to swim yet. We don't know how to embrace her boundless enthusiasm or her volcanic bursts of vitality. It's hard for the rest of us, I think, to keep up with the dashing, reckless train of her happiness. Hard for me, at least, to let her be when I keep on feeling that I have to save her from the world. I'm constantly imagining that she'll fall or get burned or be run over, or that she'll drown right now in this guitar-shaped swimming pool in Memphis, Tennessee, her face, in my mind, all blue and swollen. A friend of mine calls this the rescue distance, the constant equation operating in a parent's mind where time and distance are factored in to calculate whether it would be possible to save a child from danger. But at some point, like flipping a switch, we all stop calculating grim catastrophes and let go. We tacitly agree to follow her instead of expecting her to stay back with us in our safe incapacity for life. We howl, ululate, roar. We plunge and resurface to float on our backs, looking up at the cloudless sky. We open our eyes wide inside the burning chlorine water. We emulate shitty fountain statues, spouting water from our mouths. I teach them a choreography for All Shook Up that I vaguely remember being taught by a childhood friend. A lot of shoulder shaking and some hip back and forth in the uhs of the song. And then, when the spell the girl has cast on us finally evaporates, we all sit by the edge of the pool, dangling our feet in the water and catching our breath. Later that night, lying in the dark of our motel bedroom, my husband tells the two children an Apache story about how Apaches earned their war names. We listen to him, silent. His voice rises and whirls around the room, carried across the thick, hot air that the ceiling fan stirs, its cheap veneer blades squeaking a bit. We lie face up, trying to catch a breeze, except the girl. She lies on her tummy and sucks her thumb, her suck rhythm in syncopation with the cyclical rattle of paddles bubbling in the ceiling fan. The boy waits for his father to finish the story and then says, if she were an Apache, her name would be Loud Thumb. Me, the girl asks, unplugging her thumb from her mouth and raising her head in the dark, not convinced, but always proud to be talked about. Yes, Loud Thumb or Suck Thumb? No. My war name would be Grace, Land Memphis, Tennessee. Or Guitar Swimming Pool. Either or. Those are not Apache names, right, Pa? No, they're not, my husband confirms. Guitar Swimming Pool is not an Apache name. Well, then I want to be Grace Land Memphis, she says. It's Graceland, Memphis, you moron, the boy informs her from the heights of his now 10-year-old superiority. Fine then, so I'll be Memphis, just Memphis. She says this with the authoritative assurance of bureaucrats closing their plastic windows, taking no more requests, no more complaints, and then plugs her thumb back into her mouth. We know this side of her. When she's made up her stubborn little mind, there's no way to convince her otherwise, so we defer, respect her resolve, and say no more. What about you? I asked the boy. Me? He would be Swift Feather, his father immediately suggests. Yes, that's right, Swift Feather. And Ma, who's she? He asks. My husband takes his time to think about it and finally says, she would be Lucky Arrow. I like that name, and I smile in acknowledgement or in gratitude. I smile at him for the first time in days, maybe weeks, but he can't see me smile because the room is dark, and his eyes are probably closed anyway. Then I ask him, and you, what would your war name be? The girl chimes in without taking her thumb from her mouth, lisping, thething, and fumming her words. Pa, he's the Elvis, or the Jesus fucking Christ. Either or. My husband and I laugh, and the boy reprimands her. You're gonna go to hell if you keep saying that. He probably chastises her more because of our praising laughter than because of the content of her statement. She certainly does not know why she should be censored. Then, taking her thumb out of her mouth, she asks, "Who's your favorite Apache pa? Geronimo?" "No, my favorite is Chief Cochise." "Then you get to be Papa Cochise," she says, like she's handing him a gift. "Papa Cochise," my husband whispers back. And softly, slowly, we fall asleep, embracing these new names. The ceiling fan slicing the thick air in the room, thinning it. I fall asleep at the same time as the three of them, maybe for the first time in years. And as I do, I cling to these four certainties: Swift Feather, Papa Cochise, Lucky Arrow, Memphis. So this is from the boy. "You asked what's the plan now, Swift Feather. So I told you that the plan was to wait for the picture to develop. Then again, you said you badly needed water, which I knew because your lips were all chapped. And I could tell you were close to throwing a tantrum. So I said, okay, we'll go into that diner. And what's the plan after that, you asked. I told you the plan was to jump back on that train car after we got something to drink at the diner. I said we'd sleep on the roof of that train and that the train would probably depart the next morning heading west, which was in the direction of Echo Canyon. I didn't know what I was talking about, of course. I was just making everything up, but you believed me because you trusted me, and this always made me feel guilty. I thought, the plan for now is we'll go inside and we'll ask for water, sitting at the long counter, and pretend that our parents are coming any minute. And after drinking the water, we'll run away. It won't count as stealing because glasses of water are free anyway. But I won't tell Memphis this part, I thought. I won't tell her we'll have to run away after drinking the water because I know it will scare her and she doesn't need to be scared. The sun was low in the sky when we walked into the diner. As soon as we walked in, I knew we shouldn't stay too long in there or we'd start looking suspicious like we were alone, no parents. We sat at the long counter on high stools with bouncy foam. Everything around us was shiny. The napkin holders, the big loud coffee makers that smell so acid, the spoons and forks, even the face of the waitress was shiny. You, Memphis, asked the waitress for crayons and paper, which you got, and I asked for 2 waters and said we'd wait for our mom and dad to come order real things. The waitress smiled and said, "Sure thing, young man." The only other person, aside from us and the waitress, was an old man with a round, pink face. He was standing a few feet from us, dressed in blue. He was drinking a tall glass of beer and was eating chicken wings and sucking the stuck meat from between his long teeth. I could see you wanted some chicken too, because your eyes got all tear-swollen and mad like birds fighting for space on branches. But we weren't going to risk it. I said, "Focus on your picture," and so you drew a girl figure and wrote, "Sir Fuss in Love." And then it said, "Sarah falls in love." I didn't want to correct your spelling because it really didn't matter that much because who was going to see the drawing except us anyway? The man went to the bathroom and left his dish full of chicken wings right there. The waitress was in the kitchen, and when I was sure no one was watching, I reached over and snatched 2 chicken wings from his plate and handed you one, which first you held tight in your hand, and then, when you saw I was quickly eating mine, you did the same. And when we'd eaten the last bit of meat on them, we threw the bones under the counter. When the waters came with a lot of ice, I took sugar packets and emptied them into our waters, and then I put a bunch of them in my pocket for later. And the waters were so good and sweet. We drank them so quickly that I was all of a sudden ashamed to leave. My legs felt heavy and embarrassed for the waters and also for the evidence of the chicken wing bones under the counter. We sat there in silence for a while, and I helped you with your drawing and made a heart around Sarah Falls in Love, and we both made shooting stars around her and some planets. But even when I was concentrating on coloring in the planets, I knew in my mind I couldn't pretend for much longer to still be waiting for our parents to come in. I was about to not know what to do next and mess everything up when something happened that was lucky for us. I think you brought the luck. Mama always said you had a good star above you. The man next to us, with a pink, round face and long teeth, stood up and went to the jukebox in the corner. I think he was drunk because he took a long time messing around with it, pressing buttons, and his body moved a bit from side to side. Finally, a song came up, and this was the lucky part for us. It was one of our very own songs, yours and mine, one of the songs we knew by heart and had been singing in the car with our parents before we got lost, or they got lost, or everyone got lost. The song was called Space Oddity, about an astronaut who leaves his capsule and drifts away from Earth. I knew we both knew the song, so I started up a game for you to follow right there. I looked at you and said, listen, you're Major Tom, and I'm ground control. Then slowly, I put imaginary helmets on both of us, and both of us were holding pretend space walkie-talkies. Ground control to Major Tom, I said, into the walkie-talkie. You smiled so wide. I knew you understood my game immediately because also you usually do. The rest of the instructions came from the song, but I was lip-singing them, looking straight at you so you wouldn't get distracted by something else because you're always distracted by tiny things and details. Take your protein pills, I said. Put your helmet on, said the song. And then 10, 9, 8. Commence the countdown, turn the engines on. You were listening to me, I knew. Check ignition, said the song, and me. And as the countdown for space launch went down, 7, 6, I slid off the stool and started walking backward toward the door, still looking at you and lip-singing really clear. 5, 4, and then you also slid off the stool, holding the picture you'd drawn with Sarah Falls in Love. 3, 2, and then came 1, and right on 1, we were both on the ground, and you started following me, walking slowly on tiptoes and opening your eyes like when you're looking at me underwater. You could be so funny sometimes in your face. You were moonwalking, but forward, and smiling, so wide. No one in the diner noticed us, not the pink man, not the waitress, who were talking up close to each other, almost touching noses across the bar. We had already reached the swinging doors exactly when the song gets louder. This is ground control, the astronaut shouts into the microphone in the song. And I knew we'd made it when I held the door open for you, and suddenly we were stepping through it, and we're both outside, safe and free outside, not having been caught by the waitress or the man who was eating those chicken wings or anyone. We were invisible like two astronauts up in space, floating toward the moon. And outside, the sun was setting, the sky pink and orange, and the freight trains parked on the tracks were bright and beautiful, and I ran for it so fast across the gravel and around the train in front of the diner and beyond the train tracks, and laughing so hard my bladder almost exploded from all the icy water we drank. And I ran more, crossed the big road, and then ran along smaller streets until I reached the desert shrub where there were no more houses or streets or anything, just shrubs and sometimes tall grass. I kept on running because I could still hear the song, but only in my head, so I sang it in pieces out loud as we ran, like I'm floating and like the stars seem different, and also my spaceship knows which way to go. I ran so fast for so long. I was still shouting, "Can you hear me, Major Tom?" And I turned around to look behind me, but you were not there anymore. "Major Tom," I shouted many times all around me. You weren't there at all. I must have run too fast for her, I thought inside my head. I must have ran too fast for her little legs, thinking you were keeping up and you just didn't. She's so useless sometimes, I thought then, but of course I don't think that for real. You probably got distracted by something small and stupid like a rock in a funny shape or a flower that was purple. You were not anywhere. I kept on looking and shouting, "Major Tom," and then Memphis for minutes or hours till I noticed there were longer shadows growing slow under things, and I got angry, thinking maybe you were hiding, and then scared and guilty, thinking maybe you'd fallen and were crying for me somewhere, and I was also nowhere for you to see me. I walked back toward the Maverick Room diner, where we'd last been together, but I stayed some feet away from it, by the train parked outside it, because the area outside the diner was full of adults, men and women, tall and strange and not trustable. Later, I climbed up to the roof of the train wagon, the same train wagon I had taken a picture of earlier that day. I climbed to the top of it using one of the side ladders. Up there on the train top, I knew no one would be able to see me, no matter how tall they humanly were. I opened my backpack and took out some of my stuff to keep me company. I took out the binoculars, the Swiss Army knife, and the Continental Divide Trail map, and I hit the map with my fist and spit on it because I realized that by following that trail, the only thing I had managed to do was to get you and me divided. And I felt so stupid, like I'd walked straight into a trap no matter all the warnings. I put everything back into the backpack. It was no use having my things there. They were no company now. From the roof of the train car, the sky looked almost black. A few stars showed up in the sky. The song about the astronaut kept coming back to me in my head, except now the part about the stars that looked very different felt like a curse that the sky had cursed us with. And this is from the voice of the third person, and it's the 11th elegy. The elegy is a book that runs along this book, and it tells the story of these children migrating on this train. The desert opens out around them, wide and invariable, as the train advances westward, parallel to the long iron wall. The sun is rising far to the east, behind a mountain range, a grand mass of blue and purple, its contours jagged lines like hesitant brushstrokes. They're all silent, the 6 children, more silent than usual, locked up in the terrors, the 6. Some sit on the edge of the train gondola, facing the east, dangling their legs, spitting out saliva balls, just to see who gets further, but mostly gazing down at the ground that sweeps beneath them, white, brown, speckled with thorn bushes, rubbish, strange rocks. Some sit cross-legged, facing the front of the train, more alone than the others, letting the wind brush their cheeks and tangle their hair. And a couple more, the 2 littlest, remain lying down on their sides, their cheeks against the roof of the train gondola. With their eyes, they follow the monotonous line of the horizon, their minds threading thoughts and images into a long, meaningless sentence. The desert is an enormous, motionless hourglass, sand passing by, in time detained. Then the 6th boy, who is now the eldest of the group, reaches into his jacket pocket and feels the cold, concise edges of a mobile telephone. He had found the phone tucked under a track in the last train yard while he was practicing train jumping with the others and had hid it. He had also found a good black hat and was now wearing it. The man in charge had not objected to his wearing the hat, but the boy knew he'd confiscate the telephone if he caught him with it, even if it was broken and could not be used. He makes sure the man in charge is still sleeping, and he is. The man in charge is as if in a coma, far away, breathing deeply, huddled under a tarp. So the boy takes out the telephone. Its glass is smashed like a window hit by a bird or a bullet, and the battery is dead, but still, he shows the object to the rest of the children as if he were showing them a treasure found after a shipwreck. They all respond with gestures, silent but acknowledging. Then he suggests a game, tells all of them to watch him and listen carefully. First, he hands the dead telephone to one of the girls, the older one, and says, "Here, call someone, call anyone." It takes her a moment to understand what he's suggesting, but when he repeats his words, she smiles and nods, and looks around at all of them, one by one, her tired eyes suddenly looking enormous and ablaze. She stares back down at the phone in her hand, takes the collar of her shirt and stretches it outward, looking at something stitched in its inner folding. She pretends to dial a long number, and then holds up the phone tight to her ear. "Yes? Hello? We're on our way, Mama. Don't worry. We'll be there soon. Yes, everything's okay." The others observe, each understanding the rules of this new game at their own pace. The older girl quickly passes the telephone to her little sister and prompts her with a whisper to follow the game. The little one does. She dials a number, only 3 digits, noticing the embarrassing sand and soot deep under the nail of her index finger, knowing her grandmother would have scolded her if she saw those nails. She holds the telephone up to her ear. What did you have for dinner? Others wait for her to say more, but this is the only sentence she delivers. The boy sitting next to her, one of the older ones, boy number 5, takes the phone from her hand and also dials, but he places it to his mouth as if he were talking into a walkie-talkie. Hello? Hello? I can't hear you. Hello? Self-consciously, he looks around him, holds the phone to his mouth, and burps into it. Then he laughs with the awkward, uneven waves of puberty. Some of the others laugh with him, and he passes the phone down. Another boy, boy 4, receives the phone now. It trembles in his hand, and he does nothing with it. He passes it to the next boy, the third boy, who pretends it's a bar of soap and cleans his body with it, silent. Some children laugh, some force themselves into laughter. Next to him, the youngest of the children, boy 3, smiles shyly under his sucked thumb. He slowly unplugs his thumb from his mouth. It's his turn to take the phone, and he does. He looks at it, cradled in the cup of his hands, and then looks up at the rest of the group. He knows by the eyes of the others, by the eyes they look at him with, that he has to say something, that he cannot just keep quiet like he always keeps quiet. So he takes a deep breath and, looking at the phone still cradled in his palms, starts whispering into it. He speaks for the first time and speaks more than he's ever done before. Mama, I haven't been sucking my thumb at all, Mama. You'd be so proud, and proud to know we've rode on the back of many beasts for many days and weeks now. I'm not sure how long, but I've become a man, and a lot of time has passed, but I still remember the stones you used to throw into the green lake when we were there. Some of them dark, some of them flat, others small and shiny. And I have one of the stones, the one I didn't throw, in my pocket. And my trained brothers and sisters are good people, Mama. And some of them are brave and strong, and they all have different faces. There's a boy who's always angry. He talks in a strange language in his sleep. And when he's awake, he talks in our language, but is still angry. And there's a boy who's almost always serious, though sometimes does funny things. But when he's serious, he says, "We're ready for the desert, Mama." And I know he's right. And there are 2 girls who are sisters and look almost the same, except one is bigger and the other is smaller. And the smaller one is missing some teeth, like I will soon, because I can feel 1 or 2 moving already in my mouth. The 2 girls never get scared, though. Not even the smaller one. They're both gentle and brave. They never cry. They wear shirts that they keep clean no matter what. And on the collars of the shirts, their grandmother sewed the telephone number of their mother, who's waiting for them on the other side of the desert. They showed the numbers to me once, and they looked just like the number you'd also sewn on my shirt, so I can call my aunt when I cross to the other side of the desert. I promise I'll be strong. I'll promise I'll be strong when we have to climb over the wall with the rest. And I won't be scared of jumping. I won't be afraid of any beasts either, and won't ask to stop for a rest or something to eat once we cross. I promise I'll cross the desert and get all the way to the big city, and across the bridge in a beautiful new car, across the bridge to where there'll be buildings made of glass rising up to meet me, which is what the 7th boy told me, because there used to be 7 of us, and the 7th was the oldest boy. He was the only one who was not afraid of the man in charge and kept us safe from him. The man in charge looked like he was a little scared when the boy was watching him with his big dog eyes, always watching over us with dog eyes. Still now he is, I know, although he's gone now, not on the train with us anymore. The boy suddenly stops talking and plugs a thumb back into his mouth, the phone resting now in one of his own hands. The 6th boy takes his phone again, knows he has no words left to say. After a few moments, he tells the children that the phone is also a camera, and now they all have to huddle together for a portrait, and they do. They come together, but very carefully, without standing up. The train rocks constantly and sometimes jerks a little, and they have learned to listen to its movements with their entire bodies. They know when they can stand up and when they need to move across its surface without standing. Finally huddled together, some tilt their heads to one side or the other, some make peace signs or horn signs, some smile or stick out their tongues, contort in grimaces. The boy says, "When I count to 3, we all say our names." He pretends to focus. They stare straight into the telephone's eye with a strange, powerful gaze. Behind them, the sun is rising higher in the sky. The 5 of them look serious, mighty. The boy adjusts his black hat, then counts to 3. And on 3, they all shout their names, including him: Marcela, Camila, Janos, Darío, Nicanor, Manu. Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you. Any questions? Raise your hand and speak loudly. Yes, here.
Hi, for Valeria. At which point in writing Tell Me How It Ends did you decide that this could be a novel? And if so, and after deciding that, was that motivated because of the scope of the essay, or the limited scope of the essay, or what did you feel you were able to access through writing as a novel?
Yeah, it was kind of the other way around. I started writing this novel if taking notes in a journal means starting to write a novel, which for me, I think it does. In the summer of 2014, and then I got deeply involved with translating in court, and naturally, I guess, started filling up with rage and frustration. And then I started trying to use that novel that I had started a year and a half previous, maybe a year before, as a kind of vessel to speak about the political circumstances, or also just like as this depository for my frustration and rage and confusion. And I realized then that I was doing a disservice both to the novel and to the subject matter. I was trying to weave in meditations about American interventionism in Guatemala in the 70s, or I was not being able to thread what I needed to thread in order to tell the story of the crisis. And I was just stuffing the novel. Fiction needs to breathe a certain way. You can't just stuff it. You have to, it's like an animal that runs on its own, right? And you can't just control it that much. And so I stopped writing it, and with some editorial pressure from John Freeman, who's around here, that I thank him so much for that, he kept on saying to me, you have to write that essay. And I kept on saying, no, I can't. I can't write it. I don't know enough. I don't understand the immigration system. I can't write it. But I eventually gave in. Editors always win those battles, right? And I decided to kind of self-educate as best as possible, and really actually with help from a lot of people. Now a good friend of mine who might be here, Rebecca Sosa, who's an immigration lawyer, really showed me, gave me literature, talked to me. I went to several courses, and I was able then to very straightforwardly write Tell Me How It Ends, which was what I had to do. I couldn't think about anything else. I couldn't write about anything else. So I wrote that book. And then I was able, later, having finished it, to go back to the novel and let it move at the pace that a novel has to move.
One of the things I was thinking about listening to both of you read, and Jamel, maybe you could take this one to start, is the choices you make to tell these stories in the first person. Your whole book is obviously not told from first person, and neither is the novel. But what is the choice to go into the first person do for you as an artist? One of the themes that kept coming up in the meeting with the students beforehand was this idea of creative freedom. And do you feel more free, no matter which character you're embodying in the first person?
I think the first person does come with a certain freedom of voice that I find attractive, and many of my first attempts at fiction, I naturally migrated to the first person. I think that's probably true more broadly. But the thing that's challenging about the first person, and the thing that's interesting to me, one of the things that's challenging and interesting to me, is the ways in which the first person can implicate him or herself in the story. So you're telling the story, but you also have to reveal the ways in which you're bound up in all the trouble of the story. So the piece I read from earlier, to me it's important that Eric is the narrator of that story, because the telling of the story is a challenge for him, and it's that friction between the freedom of the voice and the restrictions placed on you as someone who maybe feels some sort of guilt or some sort of involvement in the trouble of the story that's interesting to me, that tension.
Do you want to talk about the first person? Writing in the first person?
Not concerned.
Okay.
But if you want me to, I will. No, let's hear the audio first.
Yes.
Okay. I think in terms of my own experience in that story, the skin in the game that I have with this story is the fact that I think a lot about sibling relationships. I am a brother. I am an older brother, like the character in that story. But beyond that, much of the action is completely invented. So I never tried to kill my brother, for instance, while we wrestled. We never went to a capoeira conference together. So all of that is sort of invented, but the obsession with the question of what it means to be a sibling, to be a brother, to be a sister, in other words, to share so many life experiences together, but to be affected by those experiences in such different ways is really interesting to me.
Yes.
So I'm going to talk about the first person now.
Inescapable.
At the end. You got me. You know, after I wrote Tell Me How It Ends, it was very clear to me that I didn't want to then simply fictionalize, from my perspective, the experiences that I had listened to, or the ones even that I had had as a listener, right? It's an aesthetic decision, but it's also a political decision. I needed to take a step away from the way that media usually covers immigration, which is either through kind of testimony, right, or through this super distant eye that just sees masses and numbers, right? There's these kind of two ways. There's things in the middle, right? But those two ways make for very narrow narratives about the immigrant experience. So in the more sort of testimonial recollections or collections of testimonies, rather, we usually see someone pack or just sort of take content of people's lives and stuff it into a mold of a narrative already well learned. The person that wants to come to America to make it, the person who is illegal, but all these things that, I mean, we kind of grow up hearing and hear every day. So I definitely didn't want to do that, and I definitely didn't. I mean, I was not going to talk about immigration from the bird's eye view of statistics either. So the novel forced me to take a step back, find a greater narrative distance, and really think about the ways of approaching a subject like that. And the novel is really not a novel about immigration. It's a novel about storytelling, and it's a novel about bearing witness, and it's a novel that is asking itself constantly how to tell the story. But it doesn't really arrive at a fixed conclusion. I'm not interested in answers in a novel, but in sort of more questionings and questions opening up. Right? So that happens through the first person voice who's meditating on this all the time. And then the narrative that does collect the stories of children traveling aboard a train is a more removed third person that doesn't necessarily place these stories in a circumscribed time and geography, although it kind of, I mean, we read it here, right? But I collected those stories, and more than the stories, just the form, the narrative form, the kind of syntax, the way that the narrative moves, the rhythm, from really reading books and looking at archives of very distant from our time and space experiences of children migrating alone in history. So from the 12th century children's crusade to children being sold aboard ships as slaves, to current narratives also of Syrian children. So I kind of read around a lot, and that is what informed this third person voice. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, no,
sorry.
please.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to add that I think in terms of my experience, as far as my own experience growing up in the Bronx or growing up in Brooklyn, and what that brings to bear on my fiction, I think of those things as compositional resources. So I know what certain apartments look like. I know the churches, I know the buildings, I know the playgrounds, I know the bars, and I know I have all these sense memories that are very strong. But that distance is important. So even though I know those things, it's important for me to fully imagine a different person or a different character's take on those kinds of things, right? Because I have my own take. And I think if I were to write an essay about those things, it would look different than it does in the fiction, even if I'm drawing on the same resources. So it's always a matter of drawing on something that feels so real to me, but then making sure that the gaze I cast upon it, the experience that I have of those things or render of those things is very different.
I was going to call on. Yeah.
What was the last part of the question?
So, like, is there a part of the conversation around your books going on right now that you want to add nuance to? And if so, what is that, right? So, like, Jamal, kind of like the masculinity thing you were mentioning,
Yeah.
Forgot, but, like, is there something that you want to add to that conversation or, like, change about how it's happening?
Yeah. I think it's interesting. One of the things that's interesting, this is my first book, and one of the things that I found interesting about having a book come out is that, the further you get into the publication process, the less the book is yours. It's not my book anymore in some ways. So a certain kind of narrative from jacket copy to early reviews to actual reviews has sort of cohered around my book, and that narrative is masculinity. And to me, that's just one of the things that my book is about. It lends itself to that analysis and to that take because of certain choices I made about the characters. But I really think that this book is I hope, it's about more than just the theme of masculinity. So I'd like to think that it's really about relationships of various kinds. Someone read the book and thought that every story was a love story, which I kind of like that take. Love stories in the broad sense, not just the romantic sense. So things like, intimacy, love, relationship, friendship, brotherhood, family. I feel like these things are right at the forefront of what I think my book is about, even if, those words don't show up as much as masculinity.
Well, the conversation about my book started today, so I don't know. Yeah, I'll say that.
How's it going so far?
I think good. But I was swimming all day because I didn't want to see too much. But I think one thing that I would say is that because of the very dire times that we live in, this novel, as many other novels or books, will be read in the context of their timeliness. But it's also it's tricky because books need not be timely. If they happen to be, it's usually like a bad sign, right? That reality is probably falling apart more than usual. But yeah, this book happens to speak about something that became much more serious than what it was when I started thinking about it. But I also don't think of this novel as a timely immigration novel, but about, as I was saying just earlier, something that takes a step back and thinks about this differently. And I don't know if this is like I've always quoted and maybe misquoted, and you would probably correct me, Frank, but I think Bolaño used to say, but I never know if I'm making this up, that novels are like written with saliva and shit and sweat. And I agree if it's true, it's something like, yeah. So, and I agree with that dirtiness of the very kind of, novels are about that. They're also about nothing in particular. They're about divorce and about love and about boredom and about children and about death and I think they should remain like that. No? A novel should always remain this kind of just huge, amorphous, about nothing thing. I didn't convince you.
Maybe we'll do one or two more before the book signing. Yes.
Ask my editors in Mexico that and how they feel about my treason. I learned how to read and write in English when I was 5, when I was learning how to read and write, because I lived in Korea then. So English was always my language of instruction at school, and it was always the language in which I read and wrote. And so what happened was that when I was in my early 20s and I wanted to start writing, and I started writing more seriously, I was very self-conscious about my not very great Spanish. It was okay, but I spoke a Spanish that was kind of like in one of those conserve, jars, like things floating. It felt like it was vacuum packed somehow. Because it was the language that I spoke at home, but I didn't live in countries where it was the language of the street. So it wasn't playful. Mexican Spanish is extremely playful. And it's a game you have to learn how to play. And if you don't play it, you really don't survive. And I felt very insecure about my Spanish. And I wrote my first book as a very conscious decision to write myself into my mother tongue. And it's also a book about my home city, or the place where I was born, but where I had not ever really lived. But I always wrote at the same time, even though that decision took place, and then I wrote other books in Spanish. The truth is that my notes are always in 2 languages, and sometimes like a single sentence maybe in 2 languages. And I'm sure that all the Spanish speakers here that live here especially know this, that there's a really, I don't know, messy, wonderful, confusing tangle between English and Spanish, especially I think Spanish in the US because it's such a big language here. So all my notes were in both languages, and my first novel, Faces in the Crowd, I began in English actually, and then I decided to scrap it because I had moved countries, had a kid, planted trees, you know, all those changes. And so I started again, and I started in Spanish, and it worked. And so basically what I do is I take notes for years, or a year, or so, maybe more, and then there's one day when it's very clear that this is the language that will tell this story best. But it wasn't a completely new experience, if you know what I mean. I wrote a 480-page dissertation in English, for example, that no one will ever read, I hope.
Are there plans for a Spanish translation of the new novel?
Yeah, I'm supposed to be at home revising that right now, so I self-translated Tell Me How It Ends after a negotiation with my editors in Mexico. Negotiations are cantina, 5 tequilas. They made me sign a serviette saying that everything I write in the language of the empire, I will rewrite myself into my language. And I did do that. I did do that with Tell Me How It Ends, but it was a 100-page book. And I had just written, it was somehow very easy to do. And with this novel, I had the very naive intention to write it simultaneously in both languages. Like, oh, it's so cool, I'm going to write simultaneous novel. And I just didn't get far at all with that. I wrote a few passages that way, and they worked kind of nicely, but you can't write a novel like that. A novel is a rhythm. You have to get into it the way you swim or dance. So I stopped doing that. And for a while, I thought I would self-translate. But as soon as I tried, I knew it was going to be a flop. So there's a very brilliant writer, my generation, who is also a good translator, who is translating it into Spanish. And then I have to decide whether I'm going to really revise it and take another year or 6 months, or just kind of like read it quickly and make sure the commas are in the right place. I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do.
Maybe one more. We haven't had too many from anybody on this side. Want to ask a question? No pressure. No? Okay. Back to... Oh, yes. Okay. You.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I've never taught any of my work, and I probably never will, but one thing your question makes me think, and I think this often actually, when I taught literature, the pedagogy of teaching literature is very different than the pedagogy of teaching writing. And often, and this happened to me when I first started taking writing classes, you know, my writing teachers would say, that's the English major talking. You know, that's the professor talking. That's the English teacher talking. And when I've taught students, I find myself doing a similar thing, meaning that, you know, often people who are really passionate about writing and literature and have been schooled in literature come to creative writing classes with their order of operations kind of off, meaning that they sort of focus on symbols, for instance, or metaphors as sort of like or themes, right, as sort of the primary engine of stories. When in fact, and I think you were talking about this earlier, you're just sort of sitting there with questions and doubts when you're writing, and sort of, you know, unlearning that and unlearning that sort of focus on higher order, you know, symbolic, thematic thinking is important to me. So I think if I were to teach my work, I would probably just sort of focus very closly on the language and how one sentence produces the next sentence, or how a sentence that follows is a surprise, and to sort of really get into the writer's mind and talk about that kind of nitty-gritty stuff before we get into larger conversations about themes and symbols. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you all. Thank you both. They're going to sign some books back there.